In this system, we'll look at a brief overview of the circulatory and respiratory system. This diagram has a lot of information here. Notice the key down here. We have the red parts of the system. These are blood vessels transporting blood that has a high level of oxygen, so it's called oxygenated blood. The blue parts of the system would be blood vessels transporting deoxygenated blood, so low oxygen levels but high carbon dioxide levels. And then the purple would be where gas exchange is happening, and that's happening in all these places where you see purple blood vessels. The pump, the heart, is at the center of the diagram here. We have the lungs up here. And then this part of the diagram would be the body. So here's a quick tour around the circulatory system. Blood on the right side of the heart. Now that looks like the left side, but the way textbooks do this is that this is the right side of the heart, this is the left side of the heart. And the reason is we can imagine this heart inside your own body, and when you look down at your heart, then this would be on the right side of your body, and this part of the heart would be on the left side. The right side of the heart is going to be pumping blood up to the lungs. The purpose of that journey is to pick up oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide waste. The blood then enters the left side of the heart. The left side of the heart will be pumping that oxygen-rich blood all around the body. All body cells need a constant supply of oxygen to complete the breakdown of glucose to get energy. When the blood gives up its oxygen to body cells, it will also be picking up carbon dioxide waste from body cells, and that turns the blood blue. And the blue blood makes its way back to the right side of the heart to be pumped to the lungs to get rid of the carbon dioxide and pick up some new oxygen. So we have two cycles, two circuits, you might say. The right side of the heart is pumping blood to the lungs and then back to the heart, and the left side of the heart is pumping blood to the body and then back to the heart. Let's look at a little more detail at the different functional parts of the system. We'll start with the heart. Well, what is the heart? Well, the structure of the heart is that it's a four-chambered organ made of muscle tissue. So here we see there are hollow chambers here, and the walls of each chamber are made of muscle tissues. There's a thick muscular tissue layer here, and then the walls over here are all made of muscle tissue. And here we see a cartoon version. The two main chambers we'll be focusing on are the right ventricle. Again, it looks like it's the left one, but it's opposite in these pictures. So that's the right ventricle and then the left ventricle. And these are going to be the two main pumping chambers of the heart. So these chambers will fill up with blood, and then what will happen is that the muscular layers here are going to contract, and that will reduce the volume of the chambers, and that will expel blood out of that chamber. So the function of the heart then is to pump blood through blood vessels. Here's an animation of the two main pumping chambers. Again, the right one here and the left one over there. And again, the walls of these chambers are made of muscle cells, and so when all the muscle cells contract, they're going to squeeze each chamber to become a smaller volume, and that will squirt out the blood from that chamber. Now the right ventricle will be pumping blood to the lungs, and the left ventricle will be pumping blood to the rest of the body. Now we said the heart was composed of muscle tissue. Here we see a light microscope picture of muscle tissue. We have multiple muscle cells. Here's higher power. We can see that muscle cells are long cylindrical cells. They happen to have multiple nuclei, which is unusual. Most cells have one nucleus per cell. The muscle cells are a little different. Now inside these long muscle cells are the proteins actin and myosin. And the way those proteins interact, they can generate a force. Now the force that is generated by the proteins is going to shorten the entire muscle cell. So when each of these muscle cells contracts, what's happening is it will shorten its length. But now consider the significance of that. Let's look up here at this picture. Here's a skeletal muscle. We have the muscle attached to the tendon and then the bone on either side. If all these muscle cells shorten their length, that will be generating a force, and that will then be moving the bones in relation to each other. So the function of muscle tissue is to contract, and that generates a force. Now, if we imagine the walls of the heart chamber is made of muscle cells, they're cardiac muscle cells. They're a little bit different than skeletal muscle cells, but nevertheless, when all of those muscle cells contract, the entire chamber will get smaller in volume. Now let's move on in our system from the heart to the blood vessels that are carrying blood up to the lungs. What are these blood vessels? Well, any blood vessel that's taking blood away from the heart is called an artery. Any blood vessel that's bringing blood back to the heart is called a vein. Now it so happens that this artery has blood that's low in oxygen, high in carbon dioxide, so it's blue. That's the only artery that is blue. All the other arteries are red because they've picked up a supply of oxygen. But let's just take a look at what blood vessels are. If you were to slice a blood vessel and put it on the microscope, so we're seeing a cross section of an artery and a vein, you'll notice that they are hollow. So they are hollow tubes. The structure of blood vessels is a hollow tube. But the walls of the blood vessels are made of living cells. And you'll notice the wall of the artery is thicker than the wall of the vein. But in both cases, they're hollow because they must carry blood. That's their function. Let's take a closer look at the difference between artery and vein wall. The artery wall has something the vein wall doesn't. Of course, there are cells that make the outer portion of the artery wall. They look similar to those in the vein, but the artery also has this thicker layer here made of muscle cells. Now think about the significance. If all of these muscle cells contract at the same time, the diameter of the artery opening is going to get smaller. In other words, this muscle layer means that arteries have the capacity to restrict blood flow. And we'll see that this is an adaptation, giving the body the capacity to regulate blood flow, depending on the needs of different organs at different times. The veins do not have that capacity. The blood in the veins has already given up its oxygen. It simply needs to get back to the heart. So there's no need to regulate the flow of the blood in the veins. But the arteries are carrying blood with high levels of oxygen, and it makes sense to be able to control the distribution of oxygen-rich blood. Here we see a scanning electron microscope picture of a blood vessel, and inside are red blood cells. So these red blood cells, notice their shape, they're small sort of rounded discs. These red blood cells are carrying oxygen. That's their job. So we have hollow blood vessels filled with blood, and the cellular component of blood here in this picture are the red blood cells. Here's another scanning electron microscope picture of muscle tissue. Here we see muscle cells, the brown ones here, and here we see a cross section of the muscle cell, and here is a blood vessel. Now blood vessels carry blood, of course, and here's a medium power picture of human blood and a higher power. All of these cells here are red blood cells, and we've got a couple of white blood cells here as well. The function of blood then is to bind oxygen in a temporary fashion so as to transport that oxygen to body cells. There's an easy way to see blood under the microscope. You just do this. And when you put it on the microscope, you see something like that. We have red blood cells with a couple of white blood cells. And here's some more blood. I have a couple of white blood cells there. Now we'll be learning that red blood cells are filled with a protein called hemoglobin, and it's that protein that actually binds oxygen. So the red color of blood is due to the red blood cells itself. The fluid in the blood does not give the red color to blood. Alright, so that brings us up to the next component of the system, the lungs. So we have the right side of the heart pumping this blue blood. It's low in oxygen, high in carbon dioxide, up to the lungs. And notice now we have the large blood vessel branching into smaller and smaller blood vessels. These smaller vessels are called capillaries. Capillaries are tiny blood vessels that connect arteries and veins. So arteries branch into tiny blood vessels so small that, as you see in this picture here, sometimes capillaries are so small that red blood cells can only travel single file through capillaries. Now, if we were to cut this capillary and look at a cross section, we'd see something like this. Now this is a cartoon version of what a capillary cell is. Here's its nucleus, and what it's doing is extending portions of its membrane, sort of like an amoeba engulfing its prey, creating a hollow space. That hollow space is the space through which red blood cells travel. So this red blood cell would be that red blood cell right there. So the capillaries are made from living cells. All of these systems are made of living cells. So now we've seen what the capillaries look like, but what about lung tissue itself? What's going on in the lungs, and what does lung tissue look like under the microscope? Well, here's what lung tissue looks like under the microscope. We have low power, medium power, high power. It looks like a lot of empty space. There are these rings of tissue. In fact, at high power, we can see these rings. We can see that the rings are made of lung cells. Now, why would lung tissue look this way? Well, let's think about what the lung is. It's an airway that branches into smaller and smaller tubes that air goes down when we inhale, but then the air ends in hollow chambers called air sacs. We're going to call them air sacs instead of alveoli. So here we see what they would look like from the outside, but if we cut them in cross-section, we would see sort of these rings. Notice that there are blood vessels surrounding the air sacs. So when we see a ring of lung cells here, we have sliced a hollow chamber. We've sliced it so thin that we see a ring of tissue. Here we see some more pictures of lung tissue under the microscope. The darker stained objects would be the nuclei of lung cells. Now, to see what's really going on in the lungs, this diagram can be helpful. Here are the air sacs, a whole bunch of air sacs. So they are the dead end spaces that inhaled air goes to. And surrounding each of the air sacs are capillaries. Now notice the blue blood vessel here. This would be coming from the right side of the heart, carrying blood low in oxygen. The whole purpose of sending blood to the lungs is to pick up oxygen, and that will account for the color change as the blood absorbs oxygen. Let's take a look at this section right here. They're going to magnify it in this picture down here. So where are we here? Here's an air sac that we are looking at cross-section. So there would be fresh air would have been inhaled, and the air is right here. In that air is high levels of oxygen. So we have oxygen in the air is going to move across the wall of the lung, across the wall of the capillary, and into the red blood cell. Now, at the same time, carbon dioxide waste from body cells is being delivered from the blood into that space for the purposes of exhalation. Right, so the carbon dioxide is a waste gas, and we're going to exhale that waste gas. So what the lungs are doing here is gas exchange. The blood is picking up a fresh supply of oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. By the way, we see that the capillary here is made of capillary cells, because here's the nucleus of one of the capillary cells. Notice also that the color has changed from blue to red. So the red indicates that the blood has picked up a fresh supply of oxygen. Here's another look at that scene in cartoon fashion. Here we have one of those air sacs in cross section. So one of these rings right here in lung tissue is this part of the diagram right here. It fills up with air as we inhale. The oxygen in that air is going to move across the wall of the lung, across the wall of the capillary, into the red blood cells. Now, it was blue blood, you'll recall, coming up to the lungs. The carbon dioxide waste from the body cells is going to enter the air sac and then be exhaled. So the blue blood will turn red as it picks up a new load of oxygen. Here we see the red blood cells, and of course they are small and rounded, so they can travel through these tiny capillaries. That brings us back to the heart then. The blood has made its passage through the lungs, picking up a fresh supply of oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. And now we're back to the left side of the heart. The left side of the heart will pump that oxygen-rich blood all around the body. And again, the reverse process will happen. Well, the arteries are going to branch into capillaries, but now we're going to have the reverse gas exchange. So the blood is going to be giving up its oxygen and picking up the waste from the body cells, and that will turn the blood blue. Here we see, now we can add color to these diagrams. The capillaries are the connecting blood vessels between arteries and veins, and the arteries in the body are carrying oxygen-rich blood, so they're going to color it red here, and then the blood will give up its oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide, and so the blood entering the vein system will be blue. Here's an odd picture. This is a human being whose skin and musculature has been dissected away and the blood vessels have been preserved. You can see that there is a massive, extensive system of blood vessels, and that's because every body cell needs a constant supply of oxygen. Here we see these would be body cells. Every body cell is close to a capillary, so that oxygen can be delivered by the blood into each and every body cell. Why do body cells need oxygen? Because the mitochondria is the site of important chemistry, the final metabolism of glucose, and that chemistry requires oxygen. Now, mitochondria, in breaking down glucose to get energy, it also produces carbon dioxide waste. And that carbon dioxide waste then needs to be removed from the cell. It enters the blood, and here we see then that reversed color change. We have red blood now turning blue as it gives up its oxygen and picks up carbon dioxide waste. Again, body cells need oxygen because mitochondria require this oxygen to do the complex chemistry involved in metabolizing glucose. The result of glucose metabolism are small energy molecules called ATP. They carry small quantities of energy that are useful for doing cell reactions, to do chemical reactions. And the waste products are water. Here's a water molecule. Here's the oxygen, the 2 hydrogens, so this is H2O. And here's CO2, carbon and 2 oxygens. So these 2 waste molecules then leave body cells, go into the blood. Carbon dioxide is exhaled, but so is some water. And so we can dehydrate just from exhaling on a regular basis. We lose some water. Well, that means the blood in the vein system is going to return to the heart, and we're back where we started. So to see some of this in kind of real-time footage here, we're going to take a look at a goldfish tail put under the microscope, and we'll see some blood vessels with blood moving through them. Now what you're seeing here then is the movement of blood through blood vessels in a living goldfish tail. So the goldfish was momentarily put on the microscope, and the tail was slipped under the objective lens of the microscope, and we can see blood vessels with blood moving through them. Now some blood vessels seem to be carrying blood in one direction, and other vessels are carrying blood in the other direction. But remember, there are arteries and veins. Arteries are taking blood to the body tissues, like to the tail. Veins would be taking blood from the tail back to the heart. But in this kind of scene here, we can see individual blood cells making their way through blood vessels. And you can see the speed of the transport. The blood in the arteries here is going to have a lot of oxygen, and the whole purpose of this journey is to deliver oxygen to body cells. Meanwhile, body cells have been burning glucose and producing carbon dioxide waste, which enters the blood in the capillaries. So the capillaries, the tiniest of vessels, where we're talking about blood vessels just one blood cell thick, right? So these would be tiny capillaries. This is where gas exchange is happening. The red blood cells are giving up their oxygen content to the body cells. The body cells are releasing their carbon dioxide waste, and the blood takes the waste away.